On today's video, we're going to talk about how to use a planer board. And you don't need a big boat, you don't have to be out on a big lake, you don't need specialized equipment, and sometimes you don't even need a boat at all to use a planer board. Hey there, outdoor YouTubers. Well, like I said earlier, today's video is going to be about how to use a planer board. Now, for those of you that are kind of new to planer boards, you might be thinking, hey, don't you need a big boat to use those? Don't you need a lot of special equipment? Isn't that just for like professional fishermen? Isn't that for like serious fishermen? And I'm here to tell you, if you do any kind of trolling, I don't care if you're trolling with a 20-foot walleye tournament boat out on one of the Great Lakes, or you're trolling around with a little 12-foot aluminum boat and all you have is an electric motor, or you're just paddling in a kayak. If you do any kind of trolling for just about any kind of fish, a planer board can probably help you catch more of those fish. So what is a planer board? Alright, well, this is a planer board. And essentially it's just a device that you clamp onto your fishing line that helps spread your lines out away from the boat as you're trolling. And spreading those lines out away from the boat does two main things. The first thing is that spreading the lines out allows you to fish with more lines. The second thing is spreading the lines out allows you to troll through fish that you haven't run over with your boat. Now let me explain that. The most basic type of trolling is oftentimes one fisherman having one line off one side of the boat, another fisherman having another line off the other side of the boat, and you troll forward and you're dragging the baits behind you and you're trying to catch some fish. But one thing that happens with just a normal setup like that is oftentimes you're running over the fish that you're trying to catch with your boat. Now, if those fish are pretty deep, probably doesn't matter. But if those fish are shallow, it can matter quite a bit. So attaching this planer board to your line and spreading it out, getting it out away from the boat, allows you to present that lure or bait to fish that you haven't run over. And again, that can be a pretty big benefit if those fish are up near the surface or in shallow water. And then the other benefit to using planer boards is it does allow you to troll with more lines. Oftentimes, when you're just kind of doing that conventional trolling, 2 lines off the back of the boat, that's maybe kind of the limit. Maybe you can get away with 3, but you often run the risk of those lines kind of getting tangled up because they're so tight, they're kind of confined to that one little space. Well, you start adding planer boards, getting lines spread out further away from the boat, you can add more lines. Like in this example, we've got a planer board on each side of the boat. So we've got those 2 lines out like that, and then we control with our 2 lines straight off the back of the boat. And for the guys that really get into it, you can add 2 planer boards to each side, and some guys like to fish with 3 planer boards on each side. So you can see that's a pretty big advantage. You got a wider spread, you're covering more area, you've got more lines in the water, and of course, oftentimes that's going to result in more fish. So back to the mechanics of a planer board. How does a planer board spread your line out away from the boat? All right. Well, this planer board is kind of a buoyant board. It does have some weight on the bottom here, okay? And it does ride in the water. This is the upright position. This is how it's supposed to ride. This flag is just kind of an indicator. We'll get into the flag a little bit more in a minute. But as you're trolling, you clip this planer board onto your line. You're trolling along, you let some line out just straight behind the back of the boat to a certain desired distance, and then you attach this planer board. And most planer boards have some kind of a clip set up that clamps down onto your line, and then you set this down in the water, and because of this wedge style front to it and the tension that you're going to be pulling with, the line would leave here and it would go out to your rod. You set it down in the water, you're going this way, you're forward trolling this way, and this beveled front wants to pull away from your boat, and that's what you let it do. You kind of keep a tight line to it as you're letting it out, but it'll slowly work its way out away from the boat. This one is for the left side. Here's one for the right side. I drop this one down in the water, and it would slowly work out this way. So keep that in mind if you're going to be going out and buying a few planer boards. Most of them are designed for a specific side. And once this planer board has kind of worked its way out to a desired distance out away from your boat, you would engage the reel so there's no longer a slackline condition, and oftentimes you would take that rod and reel and stick it into a pole holder and just start trolling. Now, some of you fishermen might think that you need specialized equipment to fish with planer boards. Now, it is true that a lot of planer board fishermen do use a little bit heavier duty bait casting reels and a little bit longer rods that have a lot of bounce to them, okay? Because when you're pulling that planer board along, especially if you're in kind of wavy conditions, they do kind of bounce and hop, and they are kind of constantly pulling on the rod. So, you know, guys do like to use a little bit heavier duty stuff, but you don't really have to. I fish a lot of smaller inland lakes, okay, that I don't have a lot of bigger waves on them. And oftentimes I actually fish with just regular spinning gear when I'm using planer boards. Now, I may have a little higher pound test braided line, okay, like if you were to use like 8-pound test mono with planer boards, after a while where they clip on, where your line clips onto the planer board, it can kind of wear into that lighter mono like that. So I will use like maybe a 20-pound braid, and then I'll use like a fluorocarbon leader down by the lure. But I will use regular spinning gear quite often. And I will say I don't use like really light spinning gear when it comes to the rod, because even on the smaller inland lakes, you do want to have a little bit of strength in that rod to absorb some of the pulling that's constantly being put on it by that planer board. Now, I did do another video that was just about trolling for walleyes, and in that video I did get into the specific reasons why I'm comfortable using spinning gear with planer boards. In fact, I do go into details about why I actually prefer spinning gear sometimes when I'm using planer boards. And if you're interested in those details, I'll leave a link below and you can check that video out. But suffice to say, you don't have to have heavy duty bait casting equipment. You can get by with kind of a higher medium size spinning gear with a lot of planer board applications. Planer boards come in a lot of different sizes, but the main physics of them is the same with pretty much all of them, right? They've got this angled, beveled front. They sit upright in the water like this. You let them out on kind of this tight line. You feed line out to them as they're slowly going away from the boat. But you got to kind of keep a tight line on them. If you give a planer board slack line, oftentimes they'll just kind of lay down. They can kind of get messed up on you. So you let it out under kind of a tight line. Slowly let the line out, beveled front, pulls away from the boat. For me, this is a little bit bigger planer board. Okay, this is an offshore tackle planer board. Offshore makes a great planer board. I think I bought like 6 of these like over 25 years ago, and I've been using these type for years. This is a Yellowbird planer board, and I did buy 2 of these just recently. This is a little bit smaller than the offshore, and that's kind of one of the things that attracted me to going with this newer planer board. I really didn't have any issues with the offshore. They were just a little bit bigger than I needed. So I saw this kind of this medium-sized board, and I thought that would fit what I do a lot better. And of course, newer stuff usually is improved stuff. So, you know, the offshore planer boards kind of had this older 25-year-old clip technology. These newer planer boards have much better clips, okay? They really clamp down like vice grips on the line. They don't slip or come loose, fall off the line. Now, if you were to buy a brand new offshore planer board, they would come with some really good clips too, similar to this Yellowbird. It just so happens this was really kind of the size I was looking for in a planer board. Now, you can also get these mini planer boards. And these work great for certain situations. A planer board this size really doesn't put a lot of torque on your rod as you're trolling along. So if you're interested in maybe utilizing some spinning equipment that you already have, maybe some medium-sized spinning equipment, you might want to consider one of these mini planer boards. Now, these mini planer boards do have some limitations, all right? If you're going to be trying to be out there trolling with something that has a lot of pull, like if you're going to be out trolling with maybe a bigger, heavier bottom bouncer like this, all right? Or if you're going to be out trolling with some kind of a crankbait like this one that has a big lip that's going to be digging down, putting a lot of torque and pull on the rod, well, that torque and pull is going to be on this planer board now. And kind of the downside to the mini planer board is it just doesn't have this surface area to keep pulled out away from the boat when there's a lot of pull going from behind it. So if you have some kind of bait set up, some kind of lure set up that puts a lot of drag on these mini planer boards, you're going to see they're going to wind up pulling in closer and closer to the boat. They're not going to be able to spread out as easy as if they were pulling something like, say, this crankbait with a small lip that really won't pull on them much at all. So if you are going to be pulling a rig that puts a little bit more pull and torque on the rod, you're probably going to want to use a planer board that's a little bit bigger. Okay, before we get into a few more details on how to use these planer boards, I'd like to take a quick time out with a message from my one and only sponsor, Camaro's Crawlers. Attention fishermen, don't forget to stop by Camaro's Crawlers for all your live bait needs. Ronnie Camaro still has his bait shop down in the basement of his parents' house where he lives. And Ronnie still has the freshest minnows, crawlers, and leeches. And again this summer, Camaro's Crawlers is going to be carrying bloated wood ticks. These are those wood ticks that are filled to the max with fish attracting blood. When a fish bites into these wood ticks, the liquid center explodes in the fish's mouth and makes that fish hold on that much longer. Also, if you need a Michigan fishing license, be sure to stop by Camaro's Crawlers, and Ronnie or Ronnie's pro staff or mom will direct you to a store that sells fishing licenses. So if you're looking for live bait, remember, Camaro's Crawlers sells live bait. All right, let's talk a little bit more about attaching this planer board on your fishing line. So we're forward trolling. You're going to let that bait or lure out behind the boat a certain distance, a certain desired distance, and then you're going to attach your planer board. So let's just say we're fishing with this lure. We drop this lure down in the water and we let it run out back behind the boat as we're trolling along, okay? So our lure is out that way. So after we let out a desired amount of line, we're going to attach our planer board, all right? And with this one, we're going to go ahead and we're going to slide this line, I'm using some very dark Dacron line, into our little clip here. And then we engage the clip. So now it's in there really nice and sturdy, okay? And oftentimes there's a second clip, just like there is on this one. And we put that line into that second clip. And we clamp that clip down. And then it's going to be something like this. This line is running up to our pole. This part of the line is going back to the lure. And we're pulling this along, okay? And this is a left side. So we're drop this down into the water with a tight line. And the momentum, the forward momentum of the boat, the water rushing into this is going to hit this angled front, this beveled front, and it's going to pull it away from the boat, nice and slow. And again, I talked about it earlier, but you need to keep the line tight, but you need to feed it out. Nice and easy. You don't want to give it slack line. It'll probably lay down on you. That can mess things up. So that's essentially how we're letting this out. So then at some point as we're letting this planer board out, it's going to get to a desired distance away from the boat. Then we're going to want to engage the reel, go ahead and put that pole in a pole holder, and we're fishing. Now, some people might be wondering about this flag that's sticking up off the top of this planer board. Some planer boards do have flags. These mini planer boards don't. The way this one's set up, this flag is nothing more than just kind of a visual indicator to help you see where it's at out in the water. But I can set this up to have the flag do something a little different. And I have this other one set up like that. Now, as you can see, it's kind of the same deal. We got a clip here and a clip here, all right? And we got this flag, but the difference is this back clip, okay? This back clip is actually attached to a stiff wire, which is attached to the flag. This flag is on this pivot, so when there's tension on this back clip, it tilts the flag back. And then this spring brings it back when the tension's released. All right, so what does that do for you? Well, it's kind of a strike indicator. Now, sometimes fish bite really light. And when you got a big planer board out there and it's bouncing along in the waves and stuff, a light biting fish, it might be a little bit hard to detect. Now, a lot of times the fish that I fish for, they grab the bait and they take off with it. And it is pretty obvious when you get a fish on, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes, you know, a cagey walleye will come up to that crawler harness, just kind of grab it and maybe pull just a little tension on it. And that's where this flag going back with just a little bit of tension might help let you know that you're getting a bite. Now, of course, whatever you're pulling behind this planer board does produce some tension. So you do need to match the spring tension up with the amount of pull that the lure's making. Again, if we were to use this big lipped bait, this deep diver that's going to be pulling down and digging and pulling back on the planer board quite a bit, we're going to need to adjust this spring tension accordingly. And there's a few different holes that you can move the spring out of to actually give it more tension and make it harder to pull this spring back. So there is some adjustments. You kind of got to set it up to the type of lure that you're running behind the planer board to make it effective. Another thing that this strike indicating flag can tell you is sometimes it'll tell you if you picked up some debris. I know some guys are kind of into that, but to me it's a little bit overrated. Now, if you pick up a stick or something, there might be a little extra drag and it might pull this flag back and kind of draw your attention to where you maybe got to check that. But I'll tell you this, a lot of times when you're running a crankbait, say like this one, okay, it's digging down, it's pulling. Sometimes if you pick up a piece of weed or a leaf or something, a lot of times it'll foul this lure up enough where now it's not even digging, okay? So you've got this spring all set up, you got that lure running behind your planer board, and it picks up a piece of weed or a leaf or something off the bottom, and it's not pulling more on this, it's actually pulling less. So it really doesn't, to me, it doesn't help with that so much. Now, me personally, I usually don't use my planer boards with that feature. You know, you do have to match the spring up to the tension of the rig that you're pulling. You do have to leave a little bit of slack between the front and back clip, so it does allow for movement of that back clip. You know, maybe I'm missing something, maybe I don't really see the true benefits of that. But for you guys out there that do use that feature, right, with the flag tilting back when there's a little extra pressure back there on your rig, leave some comments. Let me know what I'm missing. You know, tell me I've been foolish all this time for not utilizing that feature, okay? Like I said, maybe I'm missing something, so leave some comments and tell me what it is about that you guys really like. One of my favorite ways to utilize a planer board is when I'm kind of trolling, I'm kind of contour trolling along a shoreline. Anytime I suspect that there's going to be fish, shoreline related, up in shallower water, I'll grab a planer board, get that lure back behind it, send this planer board, you know, kind of on this recon mission into that shallower water as I'm trolling along the contour of that shoreline, and then this planer board can drag that lure up in that shallow water. Where oftentimes if you were trying to troll in that shallower water with the lure straight back behind the boat, you're going to be running over those fish before that lure ever gets to them. Another pretty cool thing about using these planer boards in shallow water is you can take a lure like this Rapala F11, this is a floating lure, It's got a pretty small bill, doesn't dive very deep at all. Well, a lure like this, if you only want it to run about a foot down below the surface, you only need to run it behind that planer board maybe 20 feet, okay? And that's probably not something that you're going to do if you're trolling it straight back behind the boat. So sometimes you can get away with not letting out nearly as much line. You know, a lot of times if I was going to be trolling a shallow lure like this, right directly behind the boat, I'm probably going to need to let out like 100 feet. So the boat is going to be pretty far away from the fish as this lure is coming by. But with planer boards, you don't really have to worry about that nearly as much, because this little planer board scooting along really isn't going to spook fish. Another pretty cool thing about using planer boards, if the fish are either shallow or they're just pretty high up in the water column, is sometimes you're trolling along and you're spooking fish, but those fish are getting spooked off to the side of the boat. Now here comes your planer board and your lures, whereas if you didn't have the planer boards, you're just spooking those fish off to the sides and you're just not catching them. Okay, so that brings us to the point where we've got our planer board out in the water, we're trolling along, and we've got a fish on. Now, generally speaking for me, if I'm out trolling with planer boards, you kind of get a feel for what they look like in the water. How far do they sit down in the water column as you're trolling along? How do they react when you're making corners? That outside planer board is going to really speed up. The inside planer board is going to slow down. So you kind of get a feel for what they look like when you're out in the water as you're trolling. Okay, so any deviation from that certainly could be a strike, a bite, a fish on, maybe you picked up a piece of debris. So you'll kind of get a feel for what they should look like and when something looks different. But most of the time when I'm out fishing and I get a fish on, it's a very obvious change in what the planer board's doing. That planer board will be going along, cruising nice and fine, and if you get a hit, sometimes it'll jerk and kind of sit back. Okay, you get a fish on, a lot of times it's going to jerk, sit back, and kind of do some weird stuff. Pull back, shoot forward a little bit, pull back. Usually it's a very obvious motion that you see in the planer board when you have a fish on. So now what do? We've got a fish on. I'll grab the pole out of the pole holder, and I very seldom set the hook into the fish. Usually by the time I've gotten to the pole, I'm pretty confident, you know, depending on what that planer board's doing, that fish is hooked. So a lot of times I'll just pull the pole out of the pole holder and just start reeling. Well, I think you guys can understand, eventually you're going to reel right up to this planer board. Now, it really helps if there's two people in the boat. You kind of can reel up, and as soon as the planer board gets close to the side of the boat, another person can unclip it and allow the person that's reeling the fish in to continue fighting the fish. It's very important though, when you're unclipping this planer board, to not get a slack line condition. I think that's a mistake that a lot of people make. They unclip the planer board to take it off to allow the fisher person to keep fighting the fish, and they just kind of let go of the line, and the line goes slack, and that's of course an opportunity for the fish to come off. So when you unclip that planer board, kind of keep hold of it and make sure the person on the rod is keeping good tension, and you can kind of slowly let that line back out as they're keeping tension on it, fight the fish, hopefully catch the fish. Now, it's a little bit different scenario when you have multiple lines out. Think about if you've got a planer board off to the right side of your boat, but you're also trolling a line straight back off the right side of the boat. You know, that could cause some problems getting that planer board in, getting that fish in, or even just bringing the line in when you're done fishing with it. So sometimes you may want to reel in that line that's on the same side of the boat as the planer board. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll take that rod out of the rod holder that's on the side that we're bringing the planer board in on, and I'll just bring it over and I'll stick it maybe straight back off the boat, or I'll stick it in a rod holder and I'll have it on the other side of the boat. There can be a little jockeying around of lines as you're bringing in these planer board rods, whether you have a fish on or not. Now, what do you do when you have possibly 2 or 3 planer boards off to one side of the boat and you get a fish on the farthest one out from the boat? Now this is where it gets a little tricky, and honestly, that's why I very seldom fish with multiple planer boards off to one side of the boat. But there's a couple ways you can do it if you do want to fish like that. So you got 3 planer boards out, and you get a fish on the furthest one. Some fishermen will go ahead and they'll give those inner 2 planer boards a free spool condition. So as you're trolling along, they'll actually fall back. And then the thought is you can bring that fish in front of those 2 that have fallen back. Now, obviously, if you think about it, you can run into problems like that. When you're doing stuff like that, it really is going to help to have multiple people on the boat. You may need somebody driving the boat, you may need somebody fighting the fish, and you may need somebody clearing the other lines to make way for things like that. The other alternative is you can bring in the 2 inner planer board lines, get them clear, and then the outside line, a fisherman can fight that fish and get that in. Again, this is probably going to take, more than one person on the boat to accomplish these things. Even just fishing with 1 planer board or 2 planer boards, it can be a little bit tricky if you're fishing by yourself, but it can be done. I fish by myself with planer boards quite a bit, and you just kind of work through it. Me personally, I almost never fish with even just 2 planer boards off to one side of the boat or the other. A lot of the lakes I fish are quite a bit smaller. I'm doing a lot of turning and ins and outs, and I'm trolling tight contours, and having that big spread just doesn't really work that well for what I do. I think if you're going to be fishing with 3 planer boards off to each side of your boat, that's more in bigger expanses of water. A lot of times where you can just kind of, start forward trolling and you can maybe go for miles in one direction. It's kind of more for that because turning around can be a little tricky the wider that spread is. So I generally don't fish like that, but a lot of guys do, and a lot of guys catch a lot of fish doing that. Alright guys, now at the beginning of the video I actually mentioned that you can utilize a planer board sometimes even if you don't have a boat. Okay, well what's that about? Well, you can actually use planer boards from shore when you're fishing a river. If I'm standing on the side of the river, I can cast out my lure, okay, a certain desired distance, hook my planer board onto it, set the planer board down in the river, and the current of the river can pull it out into some desired location out in the river, engage the reel, and you can just kind of sit there and watch it, just like you might be watching a bobber out in a lake. Well, there you go, guys. There's a little overview of how to use planer boards. And like I said earlier, you really don't need a big boat. You don't have to be a professional fisherman. You really don't need a lot of specialized equipment, all right? Even some of you guys that are out there in the kayaks, sticking a rod in a rod holder and paddling along, you might want to invest in one of these little mini planers. Get that line out maybe away from the kayak a little bit. You never know. It might be just a ticket to putting you on a few more fish. Now, guys, if you enjoyed this content, please consider liking and subscribing. And also, remember to hunt fish, laugh, repeat. This is Dave Knetter from Knetter's Practical Outdoors. Hey, thanks for watching. God bless.